Welcome. Middle schoolers, where are you at? Quietest middle schoolers ever. Hey, I just want to let you know, I know you're kind of stuck here with us today, but truth be told, my wife could testify to this. Besides like the gray hairs that just keep coming more and more and the back aches, I'm pretty much a middle schooler on the inside, so I understand. In fact, when I'm not preaching, sitting still for this long is really hard. That's why I'm always up here, right? But, so if you need to get up and stretch or whatever you need to do, like nobody's gonna judge you. I'm the first to be like that, okay? But we're just so glad you're here, and hopefully you stay awake, okay? All right. Well, hey, I'm gonna start with a question. And middle schoolers, this apply this to you as well. Have you ever stressed about money? Ever had an argument about money? Have you ever had money get in the way of your relationship? Have you ever had money get in the way of your plans or your dreams? Has money or the worry about money or the stress about money ever kept you up at night? Me too. Now, have you ever thought to yourself, if only I could get a raise, or if only I could win the lottery, or if only I would get that inheritance, which by the way is like, you're kind of wishing okay, anyways, you get that, right? Or maybe you thought, maybe middle schoolers on this one, if only my parents would give me a bigger allowance or an allowance. And some of you are 27, you're like, I'm still saying that, right? But it's just like, that would just solve this problem, right? A little bit more money would solve my financial stress. Our answer to financial stress is some sort of variation of, if I could just have a bit more money, this wouldn't be a problem. We wouldn't be arguing about this anymore. We wouldn't debate this anymore. We wouldn't have had to say no to that. We wouldn't have to limit that, right? Like a little bit more money seems to be most people's idea of what will take away our financial stress. And I love reading statistics. I find them fascinating. And sometimes they blow our assumptions out of the water. And there's a fascinating study a few years ago that they interviewed people who made $20,000 a year up to $200,000 a year in income. And they asked them all the exact same question: how much money would be enough? And on average, every single one of them had pretty much the same answer, which was about double. So 20,000, 40,000 will be enough. 200,000, 400,000 will be enough. I love the way that one author said it so beautifully. Enough is a moving target. Enough is a moving target. I love, an interview with John D. Rockefeller. Some of you are like, who's that? Don't worry, long time ago. Most of you weren't born yet. But one of the richest men in America at the time, his peak net worth was about 1% of the entire US economy. If you've ever heard of Rockefeller Square, that's where it comes from, John D. Rockefeller. He owned 90%, not a typo, 90% of the oil and gas industry in the United States. And someone asked him once, how much money is enough? And this is what he said: just a little bit more. The ancient Jews had this saying: whoso craves wealth is like a man who drinks seawater. The more he drinks, the more he increases his thirst, and he cannot stop drinking until he perishes. So today what we're gonna do is we're gonna dig a little more into another story that Jesus tells when he's talking about money. And if you weren't here last week, just to give you a quick summary of what we talked about, Jesus, as we discovered last week, talks a lot about money. In fact, some people have done the math and they're like, 25% of the time when Jesus is speaking, he's speaking about money. And some of you are like, that sounds like religious people. That, sounds like a church leader to me, right? But the thing you discover if you actually read is that he's constantly talking about money and he's never asking for any. Jesus never once asked for money. But Jesus is always talking about it. And when you start to dig into, as we did last week, what you discover is Jesus doesn't want your money. In fact, this is how we said it. Jesus doesn't want your money. He just doesn't want your money to get you. He is constantly warning of the dangers of money and greed and envy and wealth and the power of possessions to actually grip and reorient our heart. He is constantly warning people the dangers of it. And that makes up 25% of the things that he talked about. And last week we talked about the story of bigger barns, and it's this radical story that would have just been so ridiculous in the ancient world, and we kind of are actually, a little bit like that. We talked about the consumption assumption. Remember that? It's like everything I have is strictly and solely for me. And it's kind of easy to kind of just push off to the side when we think about this guy with bigger barns. But I kind of just shared that story of just getting the check from the government for our license plate renewal, and first thing that came to mind was not orphans and widows, but my barbecue. Yeah, that's right. Sometimes I get questions about my sermon. The question I got this week over and over again was, so did you get a new barbecue? I'm glad you guys listen. I'm still trying to fix it. I'm trying. Anyways, but here was the question I left you with last week. How do money and things pull on your heartstrings. You didn't have to do anything. All you had to do was think and talk about it. All you had to do the whole week was just like, every time you're in the store and you want to buy something or you don't want to buy something, you get into an argument with your roommate or your spouse of should we spend money on this or should we get that or whatever it was. I just wanted you for a week to just think about this question. How do money and things pull on your heartstrings? And then today we're going to continue, and Jesus is actually going to give us some practical tips at the end, and then we're going to get some pragmatics of how to go from here. And we're going to have some ideas of how to take some immediate action. And let me just be clear. I'm not asking for any money. Pastor on the stage, you expect him to be asking for money for the church. That's not my goal. I'm not doing that. I'm strictly talking about money because Jesus talked about money, and I'm gonna give you action steps that have nothing to do with giving to the church here. It's not what I wanna do. I wanna talk about this because Jesus talked about it, Jesus warned about it, it was serious, and so we're taking it seriously. So here's the cool thing is, wherever you're at on the financial scale, there are things and principles that are applicable to you today. Even if you're like, I have no money, that's okay. Just remember, when Jesus is speaking, and we're gonna discover today, he actually turns to his disciples. These are people who left their jobs. It's hand-to-mouth living. Like they're wondering where their next meal is coming from. And he's speaking to them when he gives them these principles. So they apply at that level and every level above it. So just remember that when we're thinking about today. And as we start, I wanna do this activity that my wife taught me years ago. I think she learned it in teacher's college and used it as a teacher for years, called unpacking our backpack. Now, as an educator, she would always tell me, she's like, Mark, like you have to unpack the kids' backpacks, and you kind of picture literal backpacks. She's like, no, there's a metaphorical backpack. And she worked in some of the roughest neighborhoods in Toronto, and she's like, Mark, every day those kids walk in with a backpack, and they're carrying stuff that you do not see. There's a kid that walked in who hasn't slept in a night. There's a kid walking in who hasn't had breakfast yet, and they will not focus on any lesson until they get some food to eat. There is a child who is exhausted because they were up caring for their siblings when their parents weren't there. There is a child who spent hours last night in a police station witnessing because they witnessed domestic assault and abuse. They're carrying that in their backpack. And unless you take time to pause and actually care about those kids and what they're carrying and walking in with and start to unpack that with them, good luck teaching a lesson and having them process it. And so today we're gonna kind of take that theory of unpacking the backpack and apply it to money, because all of us walked in here with a metaphorical backpack, you might say, of things and ideas that we have about money. Some of it passed on from our families. Sometimes we talk about money, we get into a fight with our spouse, and then our spouse says that, you sound a lot like your dad. It's like, ooh, you just turned the knife, right? Sounds a lot like your mom, ooh, right? Like, it's just like, we know that we have some stuff we're carrying from our families, but more than that, and I wanna speak specifically to our culture as North Americans, we have things in our metaphorical backpack when it comes to money and possessions, and I wanna unpack some of those today. So first of all, our view of money and possessions as North Americans is not neutral. It is shaped by our society. We weren't born stressed out about money, we adapted into that. So quick story, quick history in 3 minutes, okay? It's gonna miss a bunch of parts, but just to kind of give you a high level. Let's go to the Hitler and the Nazis. We always start there, don't we? Hitler and the Nazis, what were they excellent at? Propaganda. There's one thing you could say, they were really good at it. They were really good at lying and tricking and coercing people to believe certain things. They were excellent at propaganda. The ironic thing is they built it on Freud's theories. Freud was a Jew, but the two big emotions, the kind of survival emotions that they would play into were I want and I fear. That was what the Nazis built their propaganda on, their propaganda machine. Some of you are like, I can see some politicians leaning into that today. I want and I fear. It's amazing what you can get people to do and believe and act when they want or they fear. Now, Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, who was an intelligence officer in the American Army, thought if the Nazis can use these emotions to shape people during the war, we can use them during times of peace. And so he brought these ideas back to Madison Avenue, and Bernays, who now is actually called the father of modern advertising, after the war, things were coming together, all the factories kind of needed to pivot, they didn't need to support the war machine anymore. So it's kind of an open secret, this isn't a conspiracy theory, this is just kind of known, that there was a shadow alliance between the politicians in DC, the bankers on Wall Street, the madmen on Madison Avenue, to all work together to make Americans buy more stuff. And Edward Bernays was a genius in this. In fact, actually wrote a book called Propaganda about marketing. And Bernays' business partner, Paul Mazur, this is what he says. Ready? Let's just read his words. We must shift America from a needs culture to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire, to want new things, even before the old have been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality. Man's desires must overshadow his needs. I'd say they were successful. We don't replace things now, we simply upgrade them. Our phones are still working, we get new ones. Same with our cars and our vacuums. It's not an accident. It was planned that way. They say on average, we see 4,000 to 5,000 advertisements a day. If that sounds crazy to you, next time you're on social media, just count for 60 seconds how many ads you see as you're scrolling. 4,000 to 5,000 ads a day on average. We're at peak stuff, as one author said. We have more stuff than anyone ever in history. And yet, our peace doesn't seem to rise with the accumulation of more things. As one author said, Robert C. Roberts, upward mobility often ends not in satisfaction and peace, but in exhaustion, disappointment, and emptiness. Or as another New Yorker once said, mo money, mo problems. So as you step into this conversation on money, let's just realize what's in our backpacks. 4,000 to 5,000 ads a day targeting the two biggest survival emotions that we have, want and fear. There's a reason why talking about money is often a touchy subject. So let me invite us into an open posture to see how Jesus is going to challenge our assumptions and encourage us with regards to wealth and possessions, and actually give us some tips about worry, okay? So if you want to follow along, we're going to be reading from Luke chapter 12, verse 22. I'll give you a second to find that. Luke 12, 20. All right. Then Jesus said to his disciples, remember this is following right out of the passage from last week, right? Therefore, so he's in response to this wild story about bigger barns. Then he continues and he turns to his disciples. Remember we called the series In Training because he's just constantly training up his disciples. So he turns to his disciples, he says, therefore, right? Teaching moment. Therefore I tell you, don't worry about your life, what you will eat, or about what your body, what you will wear. Don't worry, just don't worry about it. And then later, he's gonna say something similar in verse 25. He's gonna say this, who by worrying can add a single hour to your life. Verse 25, let me just skip up to verse 25, perfect. Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Don't worry, why do you worry? Worry doesn't help. Now, can we just be honest? Let's just be honest, okay? I know you're thinking this, right? Does this not sound like your politically incorrect uncle? Right? Like, doesn't it sound like that, right? It's just like your mom just told your uncle, like, yeah, Michael's been really stressed out lately. He's really, struggling with anxiety. It's like, what are you worried about? Come on, right? What's worrying gonna add, right? And it's just like, really? Really? Like, is Jesus like my awkward uncle? Like, is that what this is? Because Jesus just seems to be that way, right? It's like, why are you worried? You can't add anything to your life by worrying. Why are you worrying? Now listen, as someone who's struggled with debilitating anxiety, the first thing I know is telling someone who worries not to worry never helps. In fact, it usually makes it worse. Yeah? Yeah. But then as you dig deeper, you realize this is not a flippant, don't worry about it. That Jesus is actually doing something very strategic. Years ago, I was at the CNE, Canadian National Exhibition. I was about 12 years old, and I did the little rock climbing wall, like 20 feet. Got to the top, didn't look down, looked down. And then, listen, so then I looked down, and they're like, hey, time to come down now. I'm like, great. They're like, hey, you can let go now. And I'm like, nope. And they're like, no, the rope's gonna hold you. I'm like, nope, right? And I remember like being up there for, I don't know how long, it felt like forever. And eventually the belayer had to kind of pull me off the wall because I wasn't gonna just let go and let the rope take me down gently, because that rope was tiny and I was 12, but I was bigger than the rope, and so no way it was gonna hold me. And so anyways, they eventually pulled me off the wall, got me down, but they forever were just like, don't worry, just come down, don't worry, just come down, don't worry, just come down. So years later, I was in youth group in like the early 2000s. You remember the youth group early 2000s, like laser tag and mini golf and rock climbing. And so my youth pastor, Andre, he was in the military reserves. Like he was like, hardcore dude, right? Like what I want to be when I grow up, and I still haven't grown up yet. But anyways, right? Like just that stereotypical guy. And so he sees that I'm kind of nervous about rock climbing. I'm nervous about, he's like, Mark, can I just tell you something? He's like, let me show you. He kind of grabs the tip of the rope. You can kind of see all the different layers. He's like, so this is the outside layer. This is how much it can hold. And then there's all those different layers on the inside. He says, on average, this can hold about 5,000 pounds. He's like, Mark, this rope can hold your SUV. Oh. All of a sudden, now that I understood what was happening, I realized worry dissipates as confidence grows. You know this, right? You take your kids to swimming lessons. I was doing this with my daughter this week. She's 4. It's like, sweetheart, jump into the pool. And she's like, no, right? So the first jump, my hands are on her. Second jump, hands there. Third jump, 2 inches away, right? And it's just like, you slowly, worry dissipates as confidence grows. You don't just tell someone, just stop worrying about it. It's like, you build their confidence. That's how you eventually take away worry. Now listen, that's not a blanket statement. Anxiety is complex. We've done a whole series on mental health. I'm not saying if you can just give people the facts, they'll stop worrying. That's not how anxiety works, okay? But just in general, with worry, the more evidence that we have, the more we worry less, okay? So with that basic principle, worry dissipates as confidence grows. If you don't run away right away when you see Jesus say, don't worry about it, you realize that Jesus is making a case to build people's confidence in God through the next few verses so that they won't worry. What follows is multiple examples to make that point and to take away their worry. So let's go through it. He says this, verse 23. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Now, for us modern people, it's like, yeah, no, there's way more to life than that. For people in the ancient world, that's a big statement. It's like, what do you mean? We're sustenance, hand-to-mouth living. That's a big statement. But Jesus is like, I want you to realize, even though I know you're worried about your next meal, there's even more to this life than just the next meal. Then verse 24, he says this, consider the ravens. They don't sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them, and how much more valuable you are than birds. He's basically saying, hey, listen, birds don't usually starve. I mean, they don't plant and they don't have storage rooms. They don't have fridges or pantries, but they always seem to get enough food. And it's like, so if the birds have enough, it's like, and you're more valuable than birds. So point one, he's just like, listen, like nature kind of works like that. God's kind of designed it that way. Now, I love Jesus always adds little details, little nuggets, little Easter eggs in the story. And I'm like, he didn't just say the birds. He didn't say the cute little chickadees on Starkey Hill that will eat from your hand. He said ravens. Which just, to the ancient Jews of the time, that was a big deal because ravens, if you don't know anything about birds, are like flying raccoons, right? They just eat everything. It's disgusting, right? They eat carcasses and garbage and bugs and animals. They eat it all. So for these, disciples that Jesus is training, like they're the most unclean animal because they eat carcasses. And for Jews, it was like touching a body was like big no-no. So Jesus uses this example. He's like, even God feeds those dirty birds, the birds that are so bad. And this is like, it's hitting home for these people. He's like, God cares so much more for you than these birds, and they seem to always be fed. Point one, in general, you don't see the birds starving and you're more important than them, okay? Now let's fast forward to verse 27 where he gives a second word picture. Consider how the wildflowers grow. They don't labor or spin. They don't punch a clock, right? Wildflowers, he's like, they just grow. He says, yet I tell you, not even Solomon was a wealthy king. It was like a word picture that would bring to mind someone very, very wealthy. Not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these wildflowers. You ever go on a hike? Go off the beaten path. Just go in a direction you're like, nobody has ever walked in this direction before. And just look, you'll find wildflowers. No one may ever see those flowers. And yet you just pause for a second and admire their beauty. And Jesus is like, those are growing. Those are healthy. You're more valuable than those. And then he continues, if that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow thrown into the fire, what? In the ancient world, they didn't have a lot of wood, so they would actually just go and take the wild flowers in the grass, dry it out. That's how they would heat and cook, okay? So he's like, if that's what God does with flowers that are literally kindling, he's like, how much more will he clothe you? And then speaking to his disciples, you of little faith. He reminds them, he's like, I know guys, you're still struggling with this faith thing, but flowers have no faith, and God takes care of them. So God's got you. And then he comes back to this theme again, verse 29. Don't set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it. And then this is his thesis statement, and I love this. For the pagan world runs after all such things, and your Father knows that you need them. Pagan was non-Jews. It was people who believed in other gods, not the Jewish God, okay? And the thing that you see all throughout ancient world, ancient history, is what we know about the pagan gods was they were impersonal. They kind of acted on a whim. I talk about storms. Whenever a storm came up, it's like, ooh, Poseidon must be angry. He's stirring up the ocean, right? Like this was the view of the ancient world and what God and gods were like. Humans existed to serve the gods. They were constantly worried. Did I offer enough? Did I dance enough? Is my crop gonna be okay? Is rain gonna come? Is my wife gonna be pregnant? The pagans had lots of reasons to worry, really, because the pagan gods were unpredictable. So Jesus is able to, in this moment, helping them unpack their backpack. He's like, I know you're worried. Everyone's worried in the ancient world about how the deities are gonna respond. But he's like, but you don't need to worry because your God is a father. So let's summarize where we are so far. Jesus is saying, listen, God knows you and loves you dearly. God makes sure flowers bloom and ravens, even ravens, have food. Even the grass that will be burned is healthy. How much more do you think your God who calls himself Father cares about you? Now, some of you might be like, whoa, hang on. You know, if you're a natural skeptic like me, you're like, whoa, hang on. But God doesn't always provide, Mark. And you'll point to places maybe in this city or this country or parts of the world where it's like those people aren't being provided for. They're really struggling or suffering. Hold that thought. I'm not going to ignore it. I'm just going to come back to it in a second because the new thought comes right here, okay? So this is kind of the next part. But seek his kingdom, verse 31, seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Okay, so what does this mean, seek his kingdom? If you're new to Jesus following, this is kind of sounds churchy, but here's how I summarize and how we summarize kingdom here. If you can go to that slide. Kingdom of God, kingdom of heaven is life as God intended it. Everything Jesus talks about, every time he invites people to live in a new way, he's inviting them to live in the way of the kingdom. And when, the kingdom is described, it's described in many ways. Number one, the first thing described in the kingdom is that humans have a relationship with their creator. Their relationship is restored. And then they live out of that restored relationship and they care for the poor, the marginalized are paid attention to, systemic injustice is eliminated, there's no more tears or violence or guilt or shame. Jesus' descriptions of the kingdom of God are beautiful. And it's constantly promised that the kingdom of God is coming, and yet we're invited to live in it now. And so while there's all different kinds of values in the world, as Jesus people, we're invited to live as Jesus is our king and his values are supreme, and we live in that way, valuing all those things that we know will be fully and finally here one day. Hence why he says, but seek his kingdom, right? He's like, as Jesus followers, we seek the kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Now this is where, again, just kind of we did a second ago with the skeptics, some pipe up and say, that's not always true, right? Some Christians, they do everything right, or at least it seems like they're doing everything right, and they suffer greatly. They seek to love their enemies, they care for the poor, and yet they're slaughtered. How do you explain that? Because the verse seems to say, if you seek the kingdom, all these other things, food, clothing, shelter, will be added to you. That's a great question. So this is where we just pause for a second and just call this out. Genre is important when reading the scripture. We talk about this often. There's all different kinds of genre in scripture. There's poetry, there's history, there's prophecy, there's apocalyptic literature, and wisdom, which we'll talk about in a second, is one of the literatures. Wisdom literature is mostly or usually true. The entire book of Proverbs is mostly or usually true. That's what a proverb is. It's wisdom. Let me give you an example from Proverbs. Proverbs 22, verse 6. You've heard this before. I'm sure you heard it a million times. Direct your children onto the right path, and when they're older, they will not leave it. Is that a promise or is that wisdom? It's wisdom. It's often true. It's almost always true. But also it's like, no, we did everything. They did everything they could. And yet the reality is it didn't go. Their child chose to go a different way. It's wisdom literature. It's not guaranteed literal. This is exactly how it'll happen. Those of you in the construction trade, measure twice, cut once. Is that wisdom or is that literal? It's wisdom. Sometimes I've measured 4 times and I still wrecked a $90 piece of plywood, right? I love the way theologians, Ben Witherington III, Amy Jo Levine point out, they're like, Jesus speaks in, we talked about this a few weeks ago, hyperbolic language. He speaks in wisdom language, and they suggest this is wisdom language. But seek his kingdom, verse 31, and these things will be given to you. Generally, you worry about the kingdom, these things are added to you, but it's not a guarantee. And if we take this as literal, it gets really messy really fast. It starts to fuel legalism. You lost your job? You must not have been seeking the kingdom very well. If you were more spiritual, you wouldn't have lost your job and your kids wouldn't be hungry right now. No, friends. Life is messy. There's a reason Jesus uses flowers as an example because yes, they bloom and they don't even have to work and they don't even have pantries. But isn't it true that storms sometimes come and wildfires come and things happen and the flowers don't always bloom? That don't try and take this wisdom literature to the bank as a literal promise. To read it literally is to miss the point that Jesus is trying to make. And the point is this, that God is worrying about our food and clothes because he's a father and he's unlike any other deity they've ever experienced. It is not a promise that no matter what, as long as you follow Jesus, you will never miss a meal. The second thing to keep in mind when we kind of have the skeptical moment that I always have is Often when we come up against this, like, yeah, but that's not true because people in, the third world, or these people suffering in this country, and, we kind of use that to disqualify the words of Jesus. And this is something that I've learned in my experience. Many of the people that we use as metaphorical prop-ups to our arguments to disagree with this passage, if you were to chat with them, as I have often and heard their stories, they would say back, do not use my story, and do not use my experience, and do not use my struggle as a way of proving that God does not provide, because my story, they would say, is one of God's grace. Often the people who face the hardest times are some of the most faith-filled people you will ever meet. They know what it is to be hungry, to not have food, and yet they testify over and over again to God's miraculous provision. And often they're the ones that struggle least with worry about provision. There's something about those who have little, who understand just how much God has given them. Here's how I would summarize this whole story. This story doesn't promise prosperity. It promises that God cares about his children's provision and well-being. It's ironic because often the people who struggle most to believe it have more than the average. It's the saltwater effect. Enough is a moving target. And then I love the way he kind of brings it all to a close. Verse 32, so pastoral in his words. Don't be afraid, little flock. This is how he's just so tender to his disciples. Don't be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. He's like, guys, I know you're worried about food and clothing, but I want you to know there's something so much bigger. You are invited by the King of heaven, by God of the universe, to be part of his kingdom. He's like, and God's so excited to have you a part of it and to give it to you. That's where you're gonna focus your energy, as we're gonna see in a minute. So then he gets really practical and he says this. Some of you have never highlighted this in your Bible. Some of you skipped it over, maybe you tried to cut it out. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Jesus is actually speaking it's like, how do we apply this? Jesus is just making it really practical. It's a choice that Jesus is giving us to limit our wealth and our possessions for the sake of others. Jesus doesn't just say, hey, message is over about worry. Go and have a small group, study about ravens and flowers and grass of the field and look at the Greek, and do a word study and then tweet about how horrible the billionaires in the world are and how if they would just do their fair share, nothing would be a problem anymore. Not that he doesn't have something to say about systemic injustice. He does, but it's not what he does here. Speaking to his disciples who do not have a lot, he says, no, you do something now. Now, not when you think you finally have enough, because enough never comes. Now. And he's saying this to his disciples who are not wealthy. And then he says this, he continues, provide purses for yourselves. The way you translate this is have bank accounts for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. He's saying invest in things that are not actual things that wear out and rust and can be stolen and be left behind when you die, but invest in things of the kingdom, which is always people. I remember a story of a very wealthy person who gave away millions of dollars. They were known for just continuously giving millions of dollars away to kingdom things. And at the end of their life, they hit some financial troubles. And someone came to them and they said, hey, now that you've hit some financial bumps on the road, don't you regret giving all that money away? And the person so wisely said, no, that's the money that I invested well. That was not lost and that was not wasted. That is a perfect example of this part of the story. And then Jesus lands with this summarizing and true statement, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. We know this. Our money and our things have a way of directing our heart. So here's the closing idea of how I summarize all this. Jesus is saying, do something. He suggests selling our possessions and giving to the poor. It's like an act of defiance against the grip that money and things can have on our hearts. And he's saying, start investing in the kingdom. Not in 5 years, not in 10 years, not when you finally get, he's saying now to his disciples. And he's saying, and watch the kinds of things that you worry about shift, because where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So here's what I want to do as we close. I want to give you a few practical ideas of ways that we can actually do things to start to break the grip of money and things on our heart and redirect them towards the kingdom, and then therefore redirect our heart towards the kingdom. As I say all the time, these practices are always invitational. I'm not checking your homework next week. You do this fully of your own volition, but I just thought it'd be really neat to bring you some different ideas that I've tried over the years that have been really helpful in shifting that. And I'm still on this journey. I'm still doing these things, but I just wanted to give you some ideas of how you could do this. I'm not saying do all 10 at once. You might want to kind of keep it as a list and try one a month and just kind of go through it and just see how these exercises start to shift the worry of our hearts to different places, because worry dissipates as our confidence grows. And so sometimes it's a little bit at a time. And as we see God's faithful, we try something else. And as we see God's faithful, we try something else. So here we go. 10 different ideas of things you could do to start to break the grip of money and things on your heart. Number one, take Jesus' words literally. Sell something and give the money to the poor. That's number one. Number two, commit. Keyword commit. Commit to give a portion of your money away. I don't care who or where you give your money, but make a commitment. You commit to Netflix, you commit to all kinds of subscriptions. Some subscriptions you don't even know, some of the things you get in the mail you don't even open. Some of you have never committed to something in a generous way. So I would just say, do that. And that's, some of you are like, that's hard. Like every month is going to, yeah, I don't even care the amount, but just make a commitment. That's option number two. Number three, buy only consumables for a month. That sounds easy, but literally only things you consume. Soap, food, dish detergent, whatever, just like things you consume. Try that for a month. Number four, just have this as a conversation between you and your roommate, you and your spouse and your kids. We're gonna ask if it's a want or need before purchasing, even before putting it in the cart. Because let's be honest, once you put it in the cart, it's purchased, right? Number five, take, you fill in the blank here, months off of buying clothes, tools, hair products, alcohol. You decide, not all. I wasn't suggesting. Some of you are like, if I get rid of, tools, I have to drink more alcohol. Listen, just pick one and add to the list, okay? Number six, choose to eat out less and invest that money in a kingdom way. Maybe you say, I'm only gonna eat out once a week or once a month, or I'm not gonna, get coffees out. And then actually intentionally think, yeah, this is how much we normally spend with tax and tip, and we're gonna intentionally give that away this month. Give that a try. Number seven, choose to overpay a service provider. That's a fun one. Number eight, pre-decide to give away a portion or all of unexpected funds. What do I mean by unexpected funds? That might be the tax return, your license fees that a lot of us got back. That might be gifts. Hey, if I get a gift, of an unexpected amount of money for whatever reason, or a raise, I'm gonna just give it away, an inheritance. Last year we had someone in our church who was selling some real estate, and they had like a price they thought, like, God, this is the amount, but if I get anything else over it, I'm giving it away. And I got a cool phone call. I've never gotten a phone call like that. They're like, hey, I have a check that I wanna send. How do I do that, right? Because they were just so excited. They had just kind of made this agreement before they knew the amount that was coming in. They're like, this is what I need to make things work. The rest, I'm just giving it away. And many were blessed by that. Remember years ago, my pastors have this thing where sometimes they, do speaking engagements. They speak at a conference, outside of work hours. And, when you do that, usually you get this little white envelope at the end, right? It's like, for gas and your time, here's a little bit of money. And I have young kids. I don't do that often. But my pastor, his kids were grown. And so he would do a lot of speaking engagements. And so one year, we were talking about generosity and challenging our church to be more generous. And so he decided, he didn't tell anyone, he just decided, he said, this year, whatever I get in those little white envelopes, I'm giving away. And I didn't even know, he just kind of did the same speaking engagement he always did. And he came to the church at the end of the year and told us what he had done. And he said, friends, he's like, I've never gotten so much money for speaking engagements. He said, I got $11,000 this year and I got to give it all away. It just becomes this like game, right? All of a sudden it's just like, as you start to grow in your faith and just realize like, God's got the food and clothing, you just have this faith to try and do more and more things. So pre-decide to give a portion or all of unexpected funds. Number 9. Give away something you don't want to give away. It's like, you know what? This thing's actually really dear to my heart, but I think maybe it's impacting the direction of my heart. Maybe I need to give it to someone else. Maybe it'll bless them. And then lastly, this is gonna sound weird, but sign up for our Managing the Finances for Freedom group. As we were talking and we kind of, looked ahead and saw that we were gonna be talking about money, we just realized we're like, for many people, like money is something you never talked about in family. We often didn't talk about it in church. And some people just have never had any help just figuring out how to budget, how to, think through the future, how to work with finances and marriage, all those different things, how to reduce debt, plan for the future, create a budget, create margin. And so we actually have a small group kind of course that's gonna be launching on, the dates here. May the 25th here at Lakeside. It's free. And as many of you are welcome to sign up as we can fit into the cafe, but we're just so excited to offer this. It's gonna be, it's well done. We actually have a video curriculum that goes with it. And so it's gonna help you if you've ever wanted to kind of, whether you're like, I have no idea how to handle money, or I just wanna start thinking about retirement. There's some bonus stuff for retirement planning and even for couples learning how to manage finances together. If that's an area that you'd just like to grow in your ability to manage funds, I've never met a really generous person who doesn't know how to manage their funds well and think through finances and budgeting. So that might be really helpful for you. And you can actually sign up online. We're actually dropping the link right now on our website for where you can sign up. And if you're in the room, lakesidechurch.ca/groups. And the person who's leading that group, or one of the leaders, is Kevin Lloyd, our finance and operations manager here at Lakeside. And let me tell you, he's a Jedi. I mean, not only does he run all the facilities and finances for this place, but there's times where I knock on his door and I'm like, Kevin, can I just get some personal financial advice? And he's just so great. He's such a beautiful heart for people and helping and practical things, and he'll be leading that. And so option number 10 is just, hey, I just need to get my finances sorted and in order so I can live a generous life. We're just so excited to offer that, and I'm so grateful for the team that's put that together. So that's that. So that's the list of 10. And next week, I'm gonna give you one more. It's actually for your kids. It's a way to practically start working this through with your kids to help them learn to be generous as they grow up. So I'm so excited to share that with you next week on Mother's Day. Let's land the plane here. I have some really cool stories, but I just won't share them because we're out of time. Don't leave here today missing the point of this entire story that the first hearers would have been flabbergasted by. Jesus is telling the people, and he's telling us today, your God, our God, is a father. He cares deeply about you. And the reason he spoke about money was not because he wanted yours, because he wanted to make sure it didn't get you and reorient you on a trajectory you never wanted to go. And maybe you're here today and you've never known God, and you've never known God anything other than a distant deity that's maybe possibly out there and maybe possibly listen to your prayers. But you need to know that the God that Jesus represented was love. He says, you can call me Father. And if you want to discover more about that God, you are so welcome here every week. Every week we're talking about Jesus, who's a perfect representation of God, and inviting you to discover more and more about him. And I just want to open that invitation to you, whether online from the comfort of your home or deck, or here in the room. We're just so glad to journey with you. So with that said, I want to wish you a great week. Our prayer teams are up at the front at the different crosses. If you need prayer for anything, and I mean anything, happy to pray for you. Online, they're happy to pray with you as well. And if you're new over the last little while and you've never been to a newcomer meet and greet, I'll see you out there with the rest of the team. Would love to put a name to a face. Have a fantastic week, friends. Take care.